Xi-Trump summit, 2 embattled strongmen temporarily calling a truce due to internal crises. Jersey News Commentary Channel. The recently concluded Xi-Trump summit in Beijing was deliberately staged with enormous pomp and spectacle by both sides. Yet beneath the glittering exterior lay very little substance. The show was grand, but the real outcomes were scarce. Deep down, both sides understood one thing clearly: it was, above all, a performance. The key word of the Xi-Trump meeting was neither cooperation, nor friendship, nor peace. It was one word: stability. Following the Beijing talks, the Chinese Communist Party's chief mouthpiece, People's Daily, swiftly published an editorial introducing a new set of rhetoric, claiming that China-US relations had entered a new positioning, characterized by 4 forms of stability: positive stability centered on cooperation, constructive stability with moderated competition, normal stability through manageable differences, and lasting stability with the prospect of peace. It sounded as if China-US relations had suddenly entered a new era, as though the global situation had unexpectedly turned a hopeful corner. But is that really the case? In reality, what is called stability is, at its core, merely a temporary truce forced upon 2 embattled strongmen, Xi Jinping being a dictator in every sense of the word, while Trump is someone deeply obsessed with power and instinctively drawn toward authoritarian rule, both compelled to pause after the eruption of their own internal crises. Why do both Xi and Trump crave stability? Because both are already overwhelmed with troubles on multiple fronts. Why does Xi Jinping crave stability? Let us begin with the economy. On the surface, the Chinese Communist Party continues to chant slogans such as high-quality development, Chinese-style modernization, and new productive forces. In reality, however, the Chinese economy is sinking into an extremely dangerous condition. The first problem is the collapse of investment. For more than 2 decades, China relied on real estate, infrastructure spending, and local government financing vehicles to fuel rapid economic expansion and growth. But at its core, this was a debt-driven investment model. Today, however, China's debt burden has become crushing. Broadly defined total debt has exceeded 400 trillion yuan, and the era of debt-driven investment has reached its end. The real estate market continues to decline. Land finance has suffered severe hemorrhaging. At its peak, land sales generated 9 trillion yuan annually, but that figure has now been cut in half and then cut again. What remains is largely a left-hand selling to the right-hand game played by state-owned enterprises. Private enterprises have been heavily punished. Entrepreneurs have been subjected to retention in custody investigations. Private firms have been burdened by universal social security obligations. More than 4 million companies have already collapsed, while those that remain live in constant fear. Under such circumstances, who would still dare to invest? More importantly, the expectations of private entrepreneurs regarding the future have turned overwhelmingly bleak. Many business owners have already run overseas, while a large number are still on the road to leaving. Secondly comes the collapse of consumption. The CCP has long promoted the idea of domestic circulation, yet ordinary people's pockets are empty. Housing prices have fallen. Unemployment is spreading like a tidal wave, especially among university graduates, many of whom graduate only to become unemployed. In recent years, around 12 million university graduates have entered the job market annually, yet the employment rate remains below 20%. As a result, consumption continues to downgrade. People no longer buy homes and dare not spend money. Young people are refusing marriage and childbirth, choosing instead to lie flat out of necessity. Once consumption collapses, the entire economic cycle turns stagnant like still water. To make matters worse, China's birth rate has entered a cliff-like decline, and this trend is highly unlikely to reverse. Today, the only thing still keeping China breathing is exports. Yet foreign capital is leaving, while supply chains and industrial chains are relocating abroad. China is becoming increasingly dependent on external demand for economic transfusions. But external demand depends on maintaining stable relations with the United States. Once relations with Washington deteriorate, the consequences could mean total failure. For this reason, the CCP desperately seeks a long-term stable relationship with the United States. The word long-term also carries another implication as Xi Jinping seeks a durable external environment to secure his continued rule. It also serves as leverage in his political bargaining both inside and outside the party. You see? Only I can manage the United States. Now let us turn to the military. The economy is worsening. Fiscal pressure is mounting. Social anger is growing. Discontent inside the party is increasing. And the military itself appears increasingly unstable. especially after the reported arrest of Zhang Youxia. An unusual silence descended over the military establishment. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The military was supposed to be Xi Jinping's final security foundation. If even that foundation is beginning to wobble, how could Xi not feel anxious? Then comes Taiwan. Xi Jinping's Taiwan card is becoming increasingly difficult to play. In recent years, Xi has continuously framed the reunification of Taiwan as his historical mission. He hopes to establish monumental achievements and surpass Mao and Deng in historical stature. It is also one of the signature political banners supporting his continued rule within the party. But now, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines are forming a new Indo-Pacific defense structure. In particular, with Sanai Takaichi taking office and adopting a strong pro-Taiwan stance, Xi increasingly feels pressure from behind. Meanwhile, Taiwan itself is strengthening its military preparedness. U.S. Taiwan arms sales continue to grow, and another $1 billion weapons package is reportedly close to being finalized. As a result, Taiwan has become an increasingly difficult bone to chew, and if Xi cannot take Taiwan, the grand narrative of national rejuvenation and historic greatness that he has carefully built over the years will be exposed as nothing more than the emperor's new clothes. This remains one of his deepest political anxieties. At this Xi-Trump summit, the Taiwan issue was clearly Xi's foremost concern and the true core interest. Yet Trump and the U.S. side largely avoided discussing it, leaving Xi deeply disappointed and frustrated. At a moment when he finds himself overwhelmed by crises, Xi Jinping has been forced to temporarily take off the wolf warrior jacket, choose compromise, pretend goodwill toward Trump, and pretend to enjoy cordial relations with the United States. Worth mentioning is that during this summit, Xi and the Chinese side also developed a subtle sense of contempt toward Trump and the United States, rooted in the U.S.-Iran conflict. Trump has become deeply entangled in it, and one of the central purposes of this visit to China was reportedly to seek Xi's assistance in helping him out of the dilemma. Naturally, Xi could not help but feel somewhat emboldened. At the same time, the U.S.-Iran conflict exposed many of America's weaknesses, the absence of an overall strategy, a lack of fighting resolve, and serious shortages in ammunition stockpiles. Moreover, the expansion of advanced weapons production depends heavily on China's supply of rare earth minerals. Xi therefore believes he has seized Trump's Achilles heel. Thus, while inwardly anxious, Xi also sensed Trump's insecurity and could not help feeling a measure of satisfaction, even quiet pride. During the meeting, Trump reportedly lavished praise upon Xi, calling him the greatest leader in the world and someone who could easily control 1.4 billion people, sparing no effort in flattery and praise. Yet Xi merely smiled without directly responding, returning instead to the issue of strategic stability. Because long-term stability in China-US relations is precisely what Xi needs most. Why does Trump crave stability even more? Because Trump now finds himself in a complete mess, facing mounting pressures and an increasingly urgent situation. This is precisely why, during the Xi-Trump summit, Trump repeatedly sought to emphasize his personal relationship with Xi, focusing only on securing a few short-term deals while showing little sign of long-term strategic planning. Interestingly, Trump received the highest level of ceremonial treatment from the Chinese Communist Party during this visit to China. The vice president greeted him at the airport. Red carpets were rolled out. Beautiful women waved flags in welcome, and children surrounded him with flowers. Trump clearly enjoyed it. His vanity was greatly satisfied. Because the CCP understands Trump well, in their eyes, he is someone deeply obsessed with appearances and personal recognition. Nothing pleases him more than face and spectacle. In short, this Xi-Trump summit was more about form than substance, more about appearances than real content. After months of talks, very little was actually achieved. Trump gained little more than symbolic gestures and small favors from Xi Jinping. Major issues such as Boeing aircraft purchases, soybean and agricultural imports, and most importantly, the supply of rare earth materials saw no substantial progress. Even if the harvest was so meager, Trump will almost certainly still boast endlessly about it to appeal to tens of millions of uncritical MAGA supporters. Because this salesman-like politician has always been capable of turning one into 10, and straw into gold bars. The only achievement truly worth mentioning from the Xi-Trump summit was the mutual commitment to pursuing long-term stability in China-US relations. But why does Trump crave stability even more? The first reason is the deadlock in the U.S.-Iran conflict. This deadlock resembles sticky dough clinging to wet hands. You cannot strike decisively, yet you cannot withdraw either. If Trump escalates into a real war, oil prices could skyrocket, domestic inflation in the United States could explode again, and voters would become furious. But if he retreats, he will not only face criticism from hawks in Congress for appearing weak, but he will also be denounced by his own mega supporters as a coward. More importantly, Trump may not even realize that the Chinese Communist Party has every incentive to quietly encourage Iran to drag the United States deeper into trouble, constantly creating strategic headaches for Washington. No matter what happens, the approaching midterm elections mean that inflation, oil prices, war, and deepening social division are all beginning to backfire politically, eroding voter confidence and damaging electoral prospects. This is the Strait of Hormuz curse, the political knot tightening around Trump's future. In Trump's imagination, reaching a framework of long-term stability with China could allow him to rely on Beijing's leverage to contain Iran and help break the strategic deadlock surrounding Hormuz. This is why the CCP's so-called five-point statement reportedly delighted Trump so much. Little does he realize that this may very well be a trap carefully laid by Xi Jinping. The second reason is the continuing fallout from the Epstein case. Trump appears to hope that a diplomatic victory abroad can suppress the growing momentum of the Epstein controversy. But is that really possible? American politics has become deeply polarized. The Epstein affair and similar controversies continue to inflame public opinion. Trump urgently wants to stabilize the political situation and fears further escalation in public backlash. Yet in his haste, Trump appears increasingly desperate and politically short-sighted. Can a single diplomatic trip truly dilute the negative effects of a scandal as politically explosive as the Epstein case? The third reason is the backlash from the tariff war. The tariff war initiated by Trump himself has begun to backfire against the United States. It has angered American businesses and imposed costs on ordinary American consumers. As a result, Trump's approval rating has fallen to around 35%. Taken together, Xi and Trump belong to the same category of political figure. Both are deeply obsessed with power. The only difference is that Trump lacks the decades-long conditioning of China's political culture. As a result, his authoritarian instincts appear comparatively immature, rougher, less disciplined, and more impulsive. When it comes to political manipulation and the art of power, Trump is still several levels below Xi Jinping. The four stabilities are nothing more than the emperor's new clothes. Let us begin with the first so-called stability, positive stability centered on cooperation. At first glance, the phrase already sounds absurd. Because today's China-US relationship is no longer one centered on cooperation, but one increasingly centered on confrontation. For the past 40 years, China and the United States indeed cooperated extensively. The United States provided markets, capital, and technology, while China supplied cheap labor and manufacturing capacity, creating a highly complementary relationship. But today, that structure has fundamentally changed. The United States launched technological restrictions against China because the wealth China accumulated through globalization was increasingly being used to strengthen party-state authoritarianism and military expansion. America has gradually awakened to the realization that decades of cooperation effectively helped nurture its own strategic rival. As a result, the United States has officially redefined China as a strategic competitor. For example, the U.S. Department of Commerce continues expanding restrictions on chip exports, AI-related semiconductors, and advanced lithography equipment. Washington has promoted a strategy of a small yard, high fence, pressuring allies to synchronize restrictions on advanced technology exports to China. The United States is limiting Chinese access to advanced computing power and restricting capital flows into sectors linked to military-civil fusion. This increasingly resembles a quasi-Cold War state. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party continues to speak of openness while simultaneously pushing the advance of state-owned enterprises and the retreat of the private sector, tightening data controls, intensifying scrutiny of foreign investment, securitizing economic governance, expanding anti-espionage enforcement, and increasing industrial subsidies. How can this possibly be called open cooperation? This is a model of high-alert state capitalism. When the CCP speaks of cooperation, what it truly seeks are U.S. dollars, foreign orders, and access to overseas markets. As for the second so-called stability, constructive stability with moderated competition, it sounds even more like a political fairy tale. America's core logic rests upon free markets, globalized capital, technological supremacy, and a maritime order. The CCP's core logic, by contrast, is built upon party-state control, state capitalism, political security first, and industrial chain dominance. The contradictions between the two are fundamentally irreconcilable. Because China-US Competition is ultimately a structural conflict between two different civilizational systems. Now let us turn to the third so-called stability, normal stability through manageable differences. This sounds even more like a form of self-comforting rhetoric. Because the greatest differences between China and the United States today are becoming increasingly unmanageable. The most obvious example is Taiwan. Beijing continues to speak of peaceful reunification. Yet military aircraft circle Taiwan, military exercises intensify, Coast Guard operations expand, and various forms of gray zone pressure continue to escalate. Meanwhile, the United States continues arms sales to Taiwan, strengthens Indo-Pacific alliances, expands military coordination, and enhances Taiwan's defense capabilities. This means that both sides are actively preparing for the worst-case scenario. How can this possibly be described as manageable differences or normal stability? And the fourth so-called stability, lasting stability with the prospect of peace, is perhaps the greatest illusion of all. Of course, China and the United States are unlikely to fall into full-scale war easily. The stakes are simply too large, and the world economy could hardly bear such a shock. But the absence of war does not equal peace. Today's China-US relationship increasingly resembles a state of long-term high-pressure confrontation. What lies ahead is more likely to be Cold War-style rivalry, semi-decoupling, and prolonged friction. Why? Because the conflict between China and the United States is no longer simply about individual leaders. It is a structural problem rooted in competing systems. Even if Trump seeks warmer relations with Xi Jinping today, the broader American political and institutional machinery will never truly become pro-China. The Pentagon will not agree. The intelligence community will not agree. Congressional hawks will not agree. The Republican hardliners will not agree. America's manufacturing interest groups will not agree. Likewise, even if Xi Jinping speaks today of stability, the Chinese Communist Party has no intention of abandoning its pursuit of technological catch-up, military expansion, pressure on Taiwan, or global industrial influence. Therefore, a temporary truce does not mean peace. Taking a breath does not mean reconciliation. Stopping the bleeding does not mean recovery. At its core, what we are witnessing is merely two internally wounded strongmen, each struggling under mounting pressures, choosing to temporarily lower the temperature for their own political survival. Xi Jinping needs time to stabilize a deteriorating economy, secure his political authority, and buy breathing room for an increasingly fragile regime. Trump, meanwhile, needs time to contain inflation, avoid the risks of a broader Middle Eastern war, suppress domestic political controversies, and prevent worsening electoral damage before the midterm elections. In this sense, the Xi-Trump summit was never truly about friendship, trust, or genuine strategic reconciliation. Nor was it about any meaningful reset in China-US relations. It was simply a tactical pause between two deeply troubled political leaders. The CCP's much-publicized rhetoric of the four stabilities is, in the end, nothing more than the emperor's new clothes. Behind the carefully staged language lies an uncomfortable reality: China-US confrontation has already become structural. Mutual suspicion has become normalized. Strategic rivalry has become irreversible. And beneath the smiling handshakes and grand ceremonies lies a truth both sides understand, but neither dares to state openly: the real contest has never stopped. The struggle has merely paused for now.